Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps there isn't a more fitting way to end the APEC CEO Dialogues 2020 than with an imprint of what APEC could be in the years ahead. It is with great esteem I announce the participation of the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who is here today to share her thoughts on APEC Re-Imagined in conversation with Brad Smith, President of Microsoft. Before the introduction of the Prime Minister, we invite you to watch this video from New Zealand.
When I think of New Zealand, I think of a place that is pure and magical, and it's the most beautiful place I've ever seen my entire life.
New Zealand is spectacular. Subhanallah. It's really that piece of heaven that is on earth.
We care for people and our planet and our future generations.
And that comes from a word in Māori that we call kaitiakitanga.
We're on a mission to make better things in a better way and tread more lightly in the way that we make products, to be thoughtful about the environment.
The only way we're going to make positive change in the world is to do things differently, and that's what we try and do.
And our gift to the world is not just our beautiful environment, but all of our talent.
New Zealand embraces and celebrates innovation, whether it be food, but also wines that stand up to the best in the world.
They created a style of Sauvignon Blanc that took the world by storm.
New Zealand is a country rich with creativity, and when you combine that creativity with the power of technology, that creates things that no one could have imagined possible.
New Zealand is right bang in the middle, and I love that very much.
And what we can offer is limitless. Technology is our fastest growing industry.
We've been able to develop boats here in New Zealand that are capable of 4 times wind speed, so we're very much pushing the edge of technology and construction.
And at Google we love Kiwis because Kiwis have this can-do attitude. You're looking for people who are just going to make things happen.
And my education in New Zealand convinced me that I could achieve anything I wanted to do.
You're taught to question, you're taught to wonder, you're taught to puzzle, to be inspired.
自由なエデュケーションを受けることができて、自由な考えを持つこともできたというふうに感じます。
At my school we've got kids from all over the world.
160 different languages are spoken in New Zealand.
Opportunities are equal to all. We're also good at other things, lots of other things. Look at the movies they make.
They do the best visual effects.
他们没有把它当成一个工业产品，而是把它当成了一个艺术品。太棒了。
Our gift to the world is our people, who succeed wherever they go.
To be a Kiwi now is something that I'm very proud of. I'm lucky that I grew up here.
And although we're only small, we believe we could take on the world.
It made me feel there is nothing impossible. It was the window to the world for me in New Zealand.
Be ready to fall in love with this country because it's not a hard task.
What is the most important thing in the world? He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It is people, it is people, it is people.
Of New Zealand, please welcome Dato Rohana Mahmood, the APEC Business Advisory Council 2020 Chair.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, kia ora. In a world where politics is increasingly partisan and common ground elusive, there are, from time to time, rare voices that cut through the noise and discord in speaking to our common humanity. One such voice in recent years is that of Jacinda Ardern, the 40th Prime Minister of New Zealand. Prime Minister in 2017 at the age of 37 years old, she has become a compelling voice for a new kind of leadership that is empathetic, compassionate, courageous, and resolute. We saw these qualities in the aftermath of the Christchurch shootings in March 2019, when she reached out to a traumatized community with empathy and compassion while denouncing terrorism and navigating stringent gun control legislation. We saw these qualities again in New Zealand's effective response to COVID-19, which her government communicated with empathy and implemented with great decisiveness. In New Zealand's general elections last month, her country responded to her leadership with a landslide victory and outright majority. It is my pleasure and privilege to present Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand, in conversation with Brad Smith, President of Microsoft, on APEC Re-Imagined. Thank you. Terima kasih. Kia ora.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm coming to you from one part of the Pacific region. Here I am at Microsoft's headquarters in Seattle, Washington. And I'm not just delighted, I'm honored to be joined virtually with one of the world's great leaders coming from another part of the Pacific region, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. Prime Minister, I think I should first say congratulations to you on an election, but perhaps more importantly to you and 5 million New Zealanders. I think you all have been a beacon of hope in a year that clearly has needed one, as you've shown us how we can manage more successfully through this pandemic. I have some questions that I'll put to you that we can talk about, but before I do that, let me turn it over to you so you can share some opening thoughts.
Kia ora and thank you, Brad. Tēnā koutou katoa ngā mihi nui kia koutou. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'd like to begin, though, by acknowledging Dato Rohana for her investment in APEC since 2015 and for her leadership as its chair during this challenging year. Now, more than ever, it is critical that APEC's voice within APEC remains strong as business and governments around the region collaborate to support economic recovery. It is especially nice to share a platform with you, Brad, as a friend of New Zealand and collaborator on both the Christchurch core and Microsoft's major investments here in New Zealand as well. And we can't ignore the virtual circumstances that we are meeting in today due to COVID-19. It is unquestionably tough as we see infection raging in different parts of the world, including in the APEC region. Some APEC economies have had more success against the virus. New Zealand has benefited from some unique advantages that have enabled us to virtually eliminate it. And yet it has come at cost. Indeed, no economy will be spared the ongoing effects of the global pandemic. The world economy is projected to shrink by 4.5% this year, barely recovering to 2019 levels next year. For the first time in decades, we are seeing major setbacks in the fight against poverty, with 90 million people worldwide projected to fall below the poverty line. In these circumstances, when we meet later tonight, all APEC leaders will be focused on having a plan for two things. First, the health response to the pandemic. Getting the virus under control is critical to allowing economies to reopen. And second, driving the economic recovery and building back better. Choices now about how to recover from the crisis will be critical to our well-being in the decades to come. It's the second part that I want to focus on, my remarks particularly today, because we see growing together in APEC as a virtual part of that plan. While I don't want to preempt the outcome of our meeting later tonight, I hope APEC leaders will agree a new vision for the Asia Pacific to guide our work for the next 20 years, focusing on three engines of economic growth: trade, digital, innovation, sustainability and inclusion. Trade has been the engine of growth and prosperity in APEC since it was founded 30 years ago. And as we confront the generation's biggest economic challenge, we must not repeat the mistakes of history by retreating into protectionism. APEC must continue to commit to keeping markets open and trade flowing. We are doing practical things that show that determination. Building on CPTPP, last week we signed RCEP, a single rulebook covering 15 markets. We must continue to ensure a level playing field and predictable rules for our exporters in the region, but also internationally. As Brad knows better than anyone, economies that successfully embrace digital technology and innovation will be those that succeed in the 21st century. All our economies need to make the right choices to ensure all our people can connect, that they have the right skills to succeed in the digital world, and that we have the right frameworks in place to support trade and competition. As we look to build back better from COVID, this is a huge area of focus for New Zealand. This year, for instance, we created a digital economy partnership agreement with Chile and Singapore to help our exporters and SMEs take advantage of opportunities from digital trade. We're committed to making New Zealand a truly digital nation. If APEC economies are to continue to grow in the long term, we must ensure growth is sustainable and inclusive. As we look to build back better from the COVID crisis, most of us around the region are making the choice to invest in infrastructure that will both grow jobs but also put us on track for decarbonisation. In New Zealand, that is about the transition towards 100% renewable electricity and the choices that will move our transport fleet towards clean energy sources like hydrogen and biofuels. And on the trade front, we are engaged in negotiations towards an agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. This world-leading initiative aims to address a range of trade-related issues that have the potential to contribute meaningfully to addressing climate change and other serious environmental issues. We also know the pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on women, Indigenous people, ethnic minorities. So we're focusing on ensuring our recovery is inclusive by getting those people back into work quickly. And not just any work, but decent, meaningful work. New Zealand takes on the chair of APEC next year, and we will be asking three things of APEC economies: to join together to reignite growth and plan for a long-lasting economic recovery, to work together to show leadership and innovation, to work for the collective good, and to grow together, to foster prosperity and well-being that is sustainable, inclusive and digitally enabled. These are challenging times, but these times also offer a significant opportunity to do things differently, APEC included. Thank you very much, and I look forward to welcoming you in APEC events in 2021, including next year's CEO Dialogue as we take on the chair. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I think that really framed so well, a variety of issues for the future. And I want to ask you about a few of them. But as we embark on that, I thought I might start with one of the lessons from last year, 2019. It may seem like a decade ago, but it was only a year and a half ago, that you had to address and the world watched and supported, I think, as you addressed the aftermath of the terrible terrorist attack and the tragedy in Christchurch. To me, one of the things that was so striking was how you used that as a moment to bring the world together and actually take action. You led the way towards the Christchurch call. You partnered with President Macron, other world leaders, and you galvanized the largest tech companies to take action, not just in New Zealand, but literally globally. As you look back at that, are there some lessons that you think are applicable for the Asia-Pacific countries more broadly in terms of the future of, say, multi-stakeholder action?
Yeah, I do. When I reflect on that time, it was within the terrible tragedy itself, and within the tool there that was used by the terrorists in that case, the thing that caused that issue for us in terms of the ability to disseminate so widely an absolutely atrocious, appalling, dehumanizing video, the ability to do that, within it also lied the solution. The fact that that could be disseminated was because we are increasingly borderless. Our social media platforms enable us to be so interconnected, and yet our way of dealing with issues when that went horribly wrong was very siloed. We needed to take that same borderless approach and collaborative approach in order to address the problem itself. So that's why for us, regulation was never going to solve our problems. We needed to be able to mobilize very, very quickly in a dynamic way, and not as government, but as NGOs and as tech companies for a common solution. None of us thought that kind of activity online was acceptable. It was against all of our values, no matter where we were in the world, whether we were private sector or whether we were public sector. So that's why collaboration was so important and continues to be.
I think this theme of, ideas spreading across borders, threats spreading across borders, in part driven by technology that crosses borders, is part of what really is defining not just the future of APEC, but the future of the world for the decade ahead. You noted that obviously COVID, a virus, respects no border, and even in a country like yours that has been so much more successful in managing it, it has still taken an economic toll. As you think about the future in the economy, what do you see as the principal drivers of a broader economic recovery in the Asia-Pacific region, and what role would you like New Zealand to play as the APEC chair in advancing those drivers in the year ahead?
Yeah, and a couple of things that we've learned along the way, and we won't be alone in this. There's been no cost-free response. But in terms of the innovation we have seen and the agility of particularly our businesses and small businesses, some surveys and reports have estimated that within a period of lockdown that we had in New Zealand, which was several weeks, we saw the equivalent of 5 years worth of digital transformation in that short period of time. The impact of that towards our economy, to productivity, will be of measurable benefit coming through the other side of COVID. So we want to find ways to continue to support with less pain that kind of digital transformation. And I believe other APEC economies will be in the same place. But we're also committed to making sure that as we rebuild our economy, we do it in such a way that we focus on those who have been most harshly affected. We're not the only place who are seeing a disproportionate impact on our Indigenous Māori people in New Zealand, on Pacific Island members of the New Zealand community, and also women. And so our recovery needs to focus very heavily on ensuring that we are focused on skills and trade training and job creation that equally addresses those hardest hit areas.
It's, I think, so striking because, here we are beginning this decade talking about COVID and the work to recover economically from it. But I still think it's fair to say that this is a decade as a whole that will probably be defined by climate issues. It may be a century that is defined by climate issues more than anything else. And of course, carbon is something else that doesn't respect borders. It spreads around the world in the atmosphere. You've been a leader in advocating for more progress in this area. What do you see as the key domestic and international steps that you would like to see taken? And where do you see the business community fitting in? Where can those of us who work in business best contribute to the kinds of steps you think are needed?
And that collective responsibility, that response from the international community is critical. Now, here we are, the other side of the world, the bottom of the world, as some may describe it, we may point to the centre, less than 1% of contributing to less than 1% of global emissions. And yet, if we collectively, as an international community, do not address climate change, it is our region that will see immeasurable consequences in terms of sea level rises. In some parts of the Pacific, this is not a hypothetical, they are already seeing their lives, their homes threatened. And so it does require that collective responsibility. Our view is that we need to have our own house in order. So we've worked very hard to try and model our expectations. We've set in our own domestic legislation an expectation of warming no greater than 1.5 degrees. We have zero carbon legislation and an independent body that will assist the government to set carbon budgets in order to reach our goals. But by getting our own house in order, that enables us then to go out into the business community and say, join us. Yes, many legislative tools create trading systems that incentivize a response to climate change. But I think there can be no greater incentive than just basic values of humanity. And working in partnership, where we say we can actually make sure we pull the levers we have as government, but we need the innovation within the private sector. We need the collaboration. That will make all the difference too.
I'm struck because there's one similarity that I see, at least, between the COVID issues and the climate issues. They're both obviously really grounded in science. They involve a lot of data. They involve conversations about phrases and numbers that people might not have been familiar with, whether it's an infection rate or, as you just put it, 1.5 degrees and why that matters. You've just gone through, obviously, a successful election that has involved a dialogue with 5 million people. What have you found is the key to talking with a broader community about these kinds of what are fundamentally scientific and data-driven issues?
Well, I think it's a great question, but even the most complex of issues can so often be distilled down into simple principles, no matter what it is. I will always remember Brad sitting in on a conversation between my grandmother and my father many years ago before she passed away, and she was a climate skeptic. Not a believer in the science or the arguments around it, and she was expressing that view to my father. And I remember him saying, "Well, Mother, I may not understand the science of it, but I know what I saw when I was in the Pacific. Chiefs there showed me where they played in the water when they were young, and they showed me where the water is now. And you can't deny what you see." Simple messages about the reality. And we in this part of the world have those messages and stories on our doorstep. So I think we well understand the consequence. What we need to do is express an optimistic path for the future. I think it's easy to lose hope, particularly when the task feels so enormous, but breaking it down into things that we can do as a country, things that we can do as a government, things we could do as business, and things we can do as individuals. Small choices around the type of public transport you take, choices around what you do with your waste. It all contributes, but it also gives a sense of hope that you can make a difference.
Obviously, in the world today, these conversations really require the use of new media. We may have grown up, at least starting in an era of television, but we live in an internet age. In order to reach people, we often have to reach people through new technology. And yet we also live in a world where this new technology is not equally available to everyone. How do you think about what it will take to close the digital divide? What does it mean, for you with the people of New Zealand? What do you think it means that we should be talking about and thinking about more broadly in all the Asia-Pacific countries?
I think we need to start turning the discussion around access to technology as in the same way that we do some of those other very, very basic tools to participate in society. And when we start thinking about it that way, we change what we do as governments. Someone described it very simply recently. They said, "I don't want any family to have to decide between bread or broadband." Previously, something that we may have considered to be a luxury item increasingly is the difference between participation in community and society, accessing critical information in times of crisis or need, and accessing education. COVID-19, I think, has sped up our thinking in that space, because previously someone might say, well, it's a luxury whether or not you choose or you have the ability to access Netflix, but they would never argue whether it was a luxury to access your school homework or work program online, and yet that's increasingly where our education is moving. And so during COVID, we worked very hard to distribute, some of the hardware required to people to move to online learning. And I think that has again accelerated a fundamental shift that we need, no matter where you live, rural, urban, whether you're young or old, in order to make sure that no one is isolated or disengaged or left behind.
One of the things that has been really striking to me about this whole issue that you just described is obviously it starts with access to devices, to connectivity, but also people need skills. And as we've looked around the world, one of the things we've noted is there was a 20-year period from 1980 to the year 2000 where businesses, employers across the board, steadily invested more in the training of their employees. And then we got to about the year 2000, and I think everybody concluded that they didn't have to train people on how to use a PC or a word processing program or email, and you could watch a YouTube video instead. And so we've had 2 decades now of declining and then stagnating investments in skilling of people. As we think about the decade ahead, I mean, what's your perspective on what it's going to require governments and what it's going to call on others to do to sort of invest in the skilling of almost all of us?
Well, actually, this is something that we broadly have been talking about for a while as a nation, in part because we've had quite a pronounced issue with productivity in New Zealand. So that naturally means that it lends itself to a conversation around what we're doing to constantly train and support our workforce. You know, where we've moved towards is just a view that actually there should be no such thing as, you know, a point that education ends, that we need to design systems that support lifelong learning. And I always view it as similar to a conveyor belt, where we jump on and we jump off at different times in our lives to upskill and retrain, and create an expectation for our younger people that is going to be the future for them, particularly with such a changeable working environment for people and, as you point out, such rapid transformation in terms of digital skills and needs. We've identified that one of the barriers, though, to learning, in a workplace is whether or not you have a permissive environment where they encourage it. And so we've had things like pledges that businesses could sign up to around increasing their budget around upskilling and training their existing workforce. We as government have looked to try and increase particularly the budgets of retraining for those departments who, for instance, have areas that might be challenged in the future, large dependency on call centres, for instance, to make sure that we are supporting a workforce that may need to transition in the future. And finally, by removing the expense of training, we recently announced that apprenticeships, for instance, are now free in New Zealand and some vocational training and education. That's an area where we needed a larger workforce, so we wanted to remove the financial barrier. As a result, we've had a doubling in the number of apprenticeships we now have in New Zealand. So as soon as we remove those financial barriers, we do see people taking up those opportunities.
Yeah, one of the things that I've really appreciated is I've had the opportunity to spend more time with you, your team, people in New Zealand, is that innovation that you described. And one of the things I've come away with is the sense that if we look at the globe the way we typically do, water and land, New Zealand is an island, or 2 islands to be more precise. But if we look at the planet a different way and look at the flow of ideas, I would say New Zealand is not an island, but a bridge. You're so often a bridge of ideas that move across the Pacific between different cultures. You're so grounded, I think, in this enormous appreciation of different heritages. It's reflected every time you open an event with your comments. And I can't help but put that in the context of APEC and ABAC and the role that you will be playing. I guess my first question is, when you think about the world of public diplomacy, it's gone virtual. You participated in the UNGA this week or this year, virtually instead of in New York. Where would you like to see public diplomacy, take these conversations about the ideas of the world in the year ahead?
Well, I'd be the first to admit that I think New Zealand and New Zealanders, probably find the virtual nature of our engagements challenging, because a value that's really fundamental to who we are is the idea of manaakitanga, which is the concept of really playing host and welcoming people and showing that hospitality. And that's one of the things that we had been so looking forward to with APEC. However, one of our other values is that we are a very inclusive and egalitarian society. So, one of the opportunities that moving diplomacy into these virtual environments brings is the ability to involve and engage wider participation in events and platforms. And so we'll be really looking to build that inclusivity, to bringing in wider groups to conversation, and to not lose the spirit or intent of that diplomacy just because we're in a virtual space. So that'll be a challenge for us, but it's one that we're up for.
So for all of us who are listening, watching, participating, as you said, there'll be meetings this evening. And this is part of what is obviously an important annual dialogue conversation. As this chair transitions to you, is there a message you want to share with I'll call it the APEC community? What should we take away from this, take to heart, and really focus on for the year ahead?
I'd say, Brad, that we are incredibly aware that APEC economies, as we're coming into our year of hosting, are rightly focused on the response to COVID-19, not just the health response, but the economic response. We believe as chairs that we are well placed to do exactly what you've described, to be a bridge, we'd call it te arawhiti, to be the bridge between nations of APEC as we work on some of the solutions that will be fundamental to all of us. And I've mentioned some of them today: digital technology, trade, making sure that we keep those supply lines open and that our recovery is inclusive and sustainable. We will be putting that all at the centre of our role as chair. And we believe as a region, we can come out stronger in our recovery if we focus on those elements over the next 12 months.
Well, I just want to say in closing, for a company like Microsoft, APEC has long been such an important forum. It brings such a large part of the world together. But I think one of the things we've always appreciated is it has made room for voices from many different cultures, many different countries, but also, frankly, for those of us who are in the business community, so that we can connect, we can be supportive, we can understand what's expected of us, and hopefully meet that challenge by raising our own ambition. So I want to thank you. I think you've given us an opportunity, almost through the inspiration that comes from the examples that you've set, to aim higher regardless of where we live, and aim to achieve more. I think we all not just hope, but even now perhaps expect 2021 is going to be a better year than 2020 for the world. I think that's our goal going in. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today. If there's any last thoughts you want to leave us with, I want to give you the opportunity.
No, my last comment would simply be to say thank you for the opportunity, to thank everyone who's participated in ABAC and worked so incredibly hard in those forums, and that we look forward to virtually welcoming everyone to APEC 2021, and to say ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa.
Prime Minister Ardern, thank you. Thank you to everyone for watching.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a resounding round of applause for Her Excellency Prime Minister Ardern and Brad Smith.